Kevin, thank you so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to share this interest of mine with you and with a more general audience. I'm going to talk about the Kabbalah in some general terms, but then apply it to the mind-body problem. So, to begin with, just a few definitions. Enigma of Consciousness is probably one of the most pressing unsolved problems in all of science and philosophy today, and it's been raging for centuries. The Oxford Dictionary will define consciousness as the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, or the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world. Historically, consciousness has been viewed in dualistic or monistic terms. Dualism being the concept that mind and matter are completely two separate things, whereas monism suggests that mind and matter may actually be composed of some identical substance that has just different manifestations. Reductionism, which is the prevailing view in science today, says or promulgates that all of existence, everything, can boil down to matter, energy, space, and time. And things such as consciousness, while they don't deny its existence, often refer to it as an epiphenomenon with no causal action within the physical world. And as I say, this is the mainstream view of science today, neuroscience. There's an important challenge to dualism, and that is simply how do matter and spirit interact if they're completely separate substances. But there's also an important challenge to reductionist monism, and that is, how does matter give rise to qualia or subjective experience, to feelings? Why is it that electrochemical discharges in your temporal lobe, for example, will conjure up a symphony, whereas very similar synaptic discharges in occipital cortex is experienced visually? There is really no compelling answer yet to this burning question, and this is what David Chalmers in 1995 coined as the hard problem of consciousness. Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who's pretty much in the mainstream thinking in psychology and in neuroscience, stated that the consciousness is maddeningly simple, that somehow gets pasted onto neural events without meshing with their causal machinery. That's a fancy way, I think, of stating that it's an epiphenomenon. Christoph Koch, who was an ardent physicalist, changed his mind, became more of a panpsychist, and in 2012 wrote that consciousness does not appear in the equations that make up the foundations of physics, nor in chemistry's periodic table, nor in the endless molecular sequences of our genes. This has led to a resurgence in the interest of panpsychism. Panpsychism has been around for millennia, but it's only recently, because of the frustration with Chalmers' heart problem, that panpsychism is now, I think, being given a little more attention. And what panpsychism says is that consciousness, or the mind, is a primordial and ubiquitous feature of all things, regardless of their size, their scale, or complexity. So panpsychism, or mind, would be on par or even primordial to space, time, matter, and energy, which I think resonates very well with not so much Western science, but with Eastern philosophy and Eastern tradition for a very, very long time. And this would, of course, resolve Chalmers' heart problem, because we no longer have to ask the question, how does matter secrete consciousness or generate consciousness when consciousness is there from the get-go. But there is a challenge to panpsychism, or to one aspect of panpsychism referred to as constitutive panpsychism, and that is, how do primitive consciousnesses that would be inherent within atoms and molecules, how do they combine within life forms to generate more complex and elaborate consciousness, as you would see in higher animals and in human beings? This is the so-called combination problem. And as I think it'll become clear by the end of this presentation, that the Kabbalah will generate ideas which will render the combination problem moot. So what is the Kabbalah? The Kabbalah can be defined simply as Jewish mysticism. It's the Hebrew word Kabbalah, shown in red here, derives from the root kabel, which means simply to receive. The Torah, which are the main scriptures and texts of Judaism, is divided into a written Torah and an oral Torah. The written Torah are the 5 books of Moses, the writings, the prophets, and there are 24 such books. And that was supposedly given to Moses on Mount Sinai, along with an oral tradition, which was not initially written down, and was the oral tradition and the written Torah was passed on to the people of the Israelites from generation to generation. And eventually, though, like in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Common Era, the oral Torah had to be written down because people were starting to forget it. But it's still referred to as the oral Torah. The oral Torah itself is divided into the revealed aspect, which was incumbent on all Jews to know. There was always very high literacy amongst Jews throughout the millennia, and they had to be well-versed in the laws of the written and oral Torah. But the oral Torah also has an esoteric component. That is the Kabbalah, the mystical component, which, unlike the Talmud, which is the Mishnah and Gemara, the main body of oral Torah that we're all supposed to learn, the mystical aspects, the Kabbalah was only studied by a very select group of sages who then passed on this wisdom to their disciples throughout the ages, largely under the radar of general Torah scholarship. There were, however, periods in history where there was a burst of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism into the mainstream, at least transiently, such as during the time of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived in the 2nd century, the mystics of the Israeli city of Safed, Tzfat, in the 16th century, with the birth of Hasidism in the 18th century in Europe. And it is anticipated that as we encroach on the 7th millennium, or Messianic millennium, which is due to happen within the next 220 years or so, there will be a tremendous outpouring of Kabbalistic truths. Before engaging in a discussion of the Kabbalah, it's important to look at where the Kabbalah and Judaism in general is viewed theologically, because there are several different approaches that can be taken and are taken by different religious traditions throughout the world. Shown on the left, for example, is the idea that God did create a universe, but then let the universe run on its own devices by the laws of physics, chemistry, etc. And this is referred to as theism. God does not so much participate in his creation at this point. And if you view this construct as God actually disappearing from the scene and all you're left with is the physical universe, this would be deism. And this is completely unacceptable to Judaism. Also unacceptable is the notion of pantheism. This is a concept that was popularized by, let's say, Baruch Spinoza in the 1600s. And it claims that God, the deity, is completely immanent within his creation, within the universe, such that if you understood the universe and all of its ramifications, scientifically, philosophically, you would know everything there is to know about God. And this, as I mentioned, is not acceptable to Judaism. The appropriate approach in Judaism and in Kabbalah and in many other disciplines, in Christianity, probably some aspects of Islam and some of the Eastern traditions, is panentheism, shown here on the right. Panentheism, just like pantheism, accepts the fact that the deity is immanent fully within every aspect of the universe, just like pantheism, but also understands that a much greater aspect of the deity is transcendent of the creation. So, in a sense, panentheism is a combination of theism and pantheism. Mm. This slide is probably one of the most fundamental slides you'll ever, or concepts you'll encounter in the Kabbalah. And that is that every aspect of the creation is composed of or coded for by 10 Sefirot. Sefirot is plural, Sephirah would be the singular. And what a Sephirah is, it's defined as either a divine force, an energy, a divine power, an attribute of God, or even an information packet. And the 10 Sefirot all stem from what's called the Ein Sof, which in Hebrew means the infinite. This is the absolutely unfathomable, undifferentiated deity. If I were to draw some analogy, and I'm sure my analogies are going to be crude, in Eastern tradition, this would be Brahman. Mm. But the Ein Sof, in order to relate to humanity and the cosmos, it does so by sort of splitting its unity into these 10 Sefirot. And so the Ein Sof, which is the infinite, first relates to the top Sephirah, which is called Keter, which means crown. And it differs from the other Sephirot in being somewhat transcendent of every deca-Sephirotic system you're going to look at, whether it's a rock or a human being or a planet. The Keter part is always a transcendent component and interfaces directly with the Ein Sof. The Keter then sends its information to a Sefirah called Chokhmah to Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and finally to a Sefirah called Malchut. Malchut, which means kingship, is the divine feminine, and it is a transducer that converts the will of God, which is in Keter. Keter is will. It's even primordial to consciousness. It's higher than consciousness, will. You don't even know where it comes from. But Malchut will then convert the influences that flow down this tree into a product that conforms with what was in Keter initially. Now, each of these Sefirot is made of light with a capital L. It's not physical light, it's spiritual light, which comes from the Ein Sof, the infinite, and the vessel of the Sephirah. And it's the vessel of the Sephirah which gives shape to the light, texture to the light, differentiation to the light. And to give you sort of an analogy, this analogy, one of my teachers, Rabbi Ephraim Goldstein, who lives in Tzfat, he uses this analogy to show that the light of the Sephirah and its vessel are really made of the same thing, but they're almost like at different energy levels. And the example he gives is, picture a mug made out of ice holding water. So both the mug and the water are made of the same molecule, H2O. But the mug is at a lower energy level than the water, but is able to confer to the water shape, texture, and even color. And that's what a sephira is. It's the light and a vessel, which is congealed light. This slide.
Hyman, I know you said that I know you said I should ask you questions between, but I'm actually wondering, maybe you should just go for it and I'll make notes and come back to it later. What are your thoughts on that?
Whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I think you're already explaining some of the things I'm going to ask, so I'm going to let you speak and then interrupt at the
Okay. Oh, fine, sure.
Good.
This slide is basically the ontology of the Kabbalah's cosmology, and it shows the creation, but pre-Genesis 1:1. And I put here pre in quotation marks because at this juncture, there is no time and there is no space. So pre is, we use it sort of metaphorically, but we have to talk about sequences or else we can't convey information. But just to keep in mind that there really is, at this point, with the data that I'm going to talk about in the slide, precedes time and space. So we start off with the ineffable, undifferentiated light of the Godhead, the Or, which means light of the Ein Sof, the infinite. It's totally undifferentiated. God then decides he wants to create a universe. The first process is referred to in Hebrew as tzimtzum, which means contraction. What the deity did was to contract some of his infinite light away from some central point, shown here in panel B in black in the center. When God did this, he left behind a thin coating or veneer of holiness, shown here in panel C in red, which is referred to as the Rishimu. And the Rishimu will become everything that is the divine feminine in every aspect of the creation. I mentioned to you before that the sphere of Malchut is the divine feminine. If you took the Malchuts of every aspect of the creation, which I'll show you is a fractal design, and you take all those Malchuts, put them together, this is what this little Rishimu is here, inside a void in which all of creation will happen. Now, in panel D, you could see that from the surrounding, the transcendent aspect of God, the deity sends into the void a ray of light, non-physical light, of course, and it's called the Kav. And you can see right away why the ontology of the Kabbalah is Panentheism, because there's clearly a transcendent aspect of God, and there's an immanent aspect inside the creation. The Kav combines with this Rishimu, and it's this combination, or mating, if you will, that creates the 10 Sefirot in concentric circles, beginning with the most transcendent Sephirah of Keter, and it moves through all other 9 till you get to the central Malchut at the bottom of the creation, as if you will. This is arranged in concentric circles, and this is the design with which God uses the Sephirot to run the laws of nature. But in order to interact with humanity, which introduces new aspects to the cosmos, namely good and evil, which doesn't exist without man. There cannot be good and evil if man did not exist. We don't call a tiger evil for killing a gazelle. But in order to relate to man through good and evil, there is reward and punishment added to as another layer of the creation. And this is handled by the 10 Sefirot, now arranged in the shape of man, Tzurat Adam in Hebrew, where now the Sefirot have a right side, like a human being, a left side, and a central component. And this creates the very first world, the highest of the worlds, highly spiritual entity, unfathomable in many ways, called Adam Kadmon, which means primordial man, because the Sefirot are in the shape of man. This slide underscores the point that I tried to make in the previous slide, that God does not create objects or events by pouring light into something to make it happen. He created the universe by withdrawing infinite light. It's a very different process. It's the act of restraint, or gvura in Hebrew, that creates, not the pouring forth of light. So, for example, in this metaphor, you can have a light that is operating at, let's say, 1 gigawatt. It is so bright that nothing can be differentiated, and you see nothing, but there's just the undifferentiated light of the Ein Sof. So to start the creation process, he lowers the wattage to 1 megawatt. And now you might be able to perceive some vague structures, but it's still highly unified. So he drops the wattage to 1 kilowatt. Now you can start to see some individuation. And finally down to, let's say, 100 watt, where our universe comes into focus. So it is the withdrawal of infinite light measured through the 10 Sefirot, accurately measured through the 10 Sefirot, that creates the kind of universe he wanted to create. I mentioned that the very first world created, shown here on the right, is the highest of the creations, called Adam Kadmon, primordial man. And like everything else, whether it's a world or an object or a pebble or an event, everything is composed of 10 Sefirot. If you count them, you'll see there are 11 here. But that's because one of them, called Da'at, is not counted when Keter is, and vice versa. So there are always 10. Depends on your frame of reference. Now, this tzimtzum, this contraction that led to the initial creation, is an iterative process. It happens over and over again and is continuously happening today. The world is constantly being created. And for example, from Adam Kadmon, there is a tzimtzum, a contraction of light within Adam Kadmon, which makes space for the next world, which is Atzilut, to form in a similar fashion. And Atzilut will then give rise to a lower world called Bria, creation, which then gives rise to formation and finally action. It's important to realize that it's only from the very bottom of the lowest world, Asiya, which means action, the lowest world, that the physical universe comes into existence. Everything in this slide to the right of Malchut of Asiya are all spiritual realms, each one to the right being more refined, more sublime, if you will, than the one on the left. And the other thing this slide shows is that each lower world encloses, the concept of hitlapshut in Hebrew, encloses or surrounds the bottom of the world deep to it, or more sublime to it. So Atzilut wraps around the bottom of Adam Kadmon, Bria around Atzilut, etc., etc. Concentric circles, sort of. And this is very, very similar to the way the 20th century physicist David Bohm conceptualized reality, when he talked about layers and layers of implicate order, each deep to the other one, and each surrounding the other one, until you finally come to a reality which is amenable to our senses and our instrumentation, which he referred to as the explicate order, which would be the what emerges from the very bottom of the world of Asiya and the Kabbalah. All the other worlds would be layers of David Bohm's implicate order, as a sort of analogy. Another way to visualize this is with this inverted telescope metaphor. On the top is the Ein Sof, the undifferentiated deity, God, basically. And he creates a universe that becomes more and more mundane, layer by layer, like the rungs of a telescope. And the rungs could be, the top rung is Adam Kadmon, then Atzilut, then Bria, Yetzira, and finally the world of Asiya. And here we are at the very bottom of the telescope in the world of Asiya. And we're at some distance from the undifferentiated light of God. Distance here, of course, being spiritual. It has nothing to do with physical distance. Proximity to God is defined in Judaism as how much you follow his will. So if you follow his will completely, you're very in close proximity, and vice versa. It's probably true of many religions. Notice also that there are these joints which represent the overlap of the worlds. Remember, I showed you one world wraps around another world, at least half of the other world above it. So there are these joints, and it's at the joints where divine influence can flow from a higher reality into a lower reality. So at this joint, for example, light from the world of Yetzirah can flow into Asiya. This is a sort of a standard reference configuration of the worlds and how they relate to each other. But when there's a lot of evil in the world, when there's a lot of corruption, either in the world at large, humanity at large, or in an individual person that can fluctuate from day to day, this is a dynamic process, the creation. And when there's evil, it's as if this telescope was stretched, extended downwards, so that now we're a lot further from the undifferentiated unity of God than we were, let's say, the day before or the year before. And there's also much less overlap between the worlds, as you can see. So much less divine goodness, beneficence, influence can flow from the higher levels into the more mundane aspects of the reality. Conversely, if we do the right thing, if we behave ethically and morally, which in Judaism means complying with 613 mitzvot. Mitzvot are commandments or statutes that the Torah expects us to adhere to. When we do this, it's as if we've contracted this telescope back towards the deity, towards the Ein Sof. And now there's far more overlap between the worlds, and the divine influence can flow in a more robust fashion from on high down. And it is anticipated that as we encroach on this Messianic millennium, within, as I mentioned, 200 or 220 years from now, there will be a more and more collapse of this telescope back upwards, as the undifferentiated nature of God will become a little more manifest throughout the entire creation. So another way of illustrating what is the relationship of these worlds is with this signet ring metaphor, which goes somewhat like this. You have a signet ring with the image of the face of a tiger, a very beautiful, highly unified, meaningful image. And you apply, when the ink is on the ring, you apply it to a first sheet of paper, and lo and behold, you have a very, very integrated face of the tiger, so conveying considerable amount of meaning. And this is, let's say, the way something may appear in the high world, relatively high world, there are higher, but in the world of Bria, creation. That's how the tiger might appear. There are no tigers in that world. It's a spiritual world, but this is an analogy. Now, when this sheet of paper and the ink on it is still moist, you take this sheet of paper and you apply it to a second leaf of paper, sheet of paper, and this creates a second generation image. If you look at the image, you can still appreciate, well, you can probably make out that this is still the face of a tiger, but it's much less unified than the way the image appeared in the higher world of Bria. This is the way things may appear in the world of Yetzirah, a lower world. You can still make out that it's a tiger, but it's degraded and conveys less information and is therefore less meaningful. Now, while this paper is still wet, quickly apply it to a third sheet of paper, And now when you look at the image, you can basically not make out that it's in any way, shape, or form a tiger. There's great disunity in the image, conveying much less information, almost looking random. And this is the way things appear to us in this low world of separation. I'm separate from you. My desk is separate from my lamp. Different ethnic groups are separated culturally throughout the world. But if you were able to peer deeper or higher into higher realms or into Bohm's implicate order, you might see more and more unification until you reach the upper spheres where there's only unity. And what this metaphor suggests is that there is a mathematical point-to-point correspondence between every aspect of an object or thing, let's call it a thing, up in the world of creation with its manifestation in lower realms. You could not have made the image as blurry as it looks. It's completely dependent on the way the image originally looked in the world of creation. So, for example, if this tiger, metaphorical tiger, were to blink in the world of Bria, this would have manifestations in all the lower domains. But in the world of Asiya, a blinking tiger in Bria may be a monsoon, let's say, in the physical world. So there's a tremendous correlation between what happens up above and what happens in the lower realms. And as I mentioned, I alluded to the fact that in our world of great separation, it's as if there is less meaning, which is a very difficult term to define. What is meaning? But we would say that meaning is not appreciating the unity of the creation. That's one type of definition that I would like to employ for meaning. And in this world of Asiya, it is as if there isn't meaning. In truth, there's infinite meaning in all realms because God is not absent. His unity is not absent from the lower world. So this is a key point. He's just hidden. He's not manifest. He's implicate. He's not in the explicate order. But if you were to able to reveal all the godliness that's really in the lowest world, it would be no different than the highest world. It's hidden. So what we see are revelations of what's underneath. So there would be very little meaning in the world of action, more meaning as you move up into higher realms, such as formation and creation. And of course, we would view the Ein Sof, the undifferentiated God, deity, as infinitely meaningful. One way to understand how meaning can flux from one realm to another is the idea of synchronicities. A synchronicity, there's a lot of interest now amongst psychologists, philosophers, even scientists of what a synchronicity is. It was made famous by Jung in the earlier part of the 20th century. And it can be defined as what appears to be an uncanny coincidence which provides an individual with a flash of great meaning, even though there's no overt causality between the two aspects of these events. Two things happen simultaneously. They don't seem to be related and causally, but they then generate a lot of meaning. And to give you an example of that, I can show you just a few slides where I look at our reality in this low world of Asiya, where there is the apparent absence of great amounts of meaning. Some people even feel they live meaningless lives, unfortunately. And the analogy is that of camping in unfamiliar terrain at night. And we can barely make out our surroundings. We hear some babbling, but we're not sure, is this, are these people speaking, or is this a babbling brook? Not sure. We hear a faint rushing sound a little more distantly. And again, we're not sure if this is a flow of a creek or maybe a more distant river. And we hear noises, hooting sounds above us, which could be an owl, but could just as easily be the wind. This is how we relate in the world of Asiya to our lives. But occasionally, a synchronicity happens, and that would be, in this analogy, like a flash of lightning, which suddenly illuminates your scene. And that is like light coming from, let's say, the world of Yetzirah, suddenly, transiently, penetrating the world of Asiya. All of a sudden, wow, you can really make out what's in your surroundings. You realize that the babbling are little children feeding some ducks. The faint rushing is a waterfall, and the hooting really is an owl and not the wind. And this provides huge amount of meaning, but it's transient. And after the lightning passes, you're left again with this scene. But you're also left with the memory of what just happened. And if synchronicities happen sufficiently often, you start to see more meaning in your life than if you don't appreciate what the synchronicity means, which is basically providing the light of God from a higher realm into the realm that you normally inhabit in order to invoke knowledge or even wonder or awe or appreciation or love. Now, when I talk about different worlds, to the Western mind, this may seem a little strange, less so to people from Advaita Vedanta, for example, this would be maybe more natural. But I'd like to make the point with the next few slides that even what we think we see in the physical world, there are layers and layers of reality which we do not appreciate. And what Immanuel Kant said was you can never really know the essence of anything in and of itself. You can only get some vague appreciation of reality through our senses. And this is definitely understood by many thinkers throughout the ages, like Galileo and John Locke. They divided all of reality into qualities that were secondary, which they refer to as subjective. Color, sound, taste, smell, temperature. These are not inherent to what's out there. If we didn't have nervous systems, we wouldn't have these things, which is amazing. Because most people will still think that something that's red is intrinsically red. It isn't red. And if you were wired differently, the color red may be the taste of a hot pepper if your nervous system was wired somewhat differently. But they refer to objective aspects of reality, such as the solidity of objects, the size, the shape, the number. And now we even know that what we call objective, even that isn't objective. Better to use the term intersubjective for the following reasons. When we look at this scene that I have here on the slide, the color of the surf is actually is electromagnetic radiation, which has no color. And it's transmitted to the retina, and from the retina through the optic nerve to the occipital lobe, which are electrochemical events that gets interpreted somehow, we don't know how, that's the hard problem of consciousness in a sense, to the color aquamarine. There is no aquamarine in the waves, and there's no motion. According to David Bohm, there really isn't motion as we perceive it. It's things popping in and out of the implicate and explicate order. And we interpret it as motion. And this is vision. And the same thing can be said about hearing. The crashing of waves do not make noise. They cause some vibrations, soundless vibrations in the atmosphere, which our auditory system interprets as sound. Same thing with touch. Water molecules are not wet, but we experience them in our qualia as wetness. The smell of the ocean, everybody's familiar with it. And we know what creates it, but the ocean itself has no smell. Those are qualia. The taste, the saltiness, again, is not intrinsic to the ocean at all. Sodium and chloride do not have tastes. we interpret that as salty. And that's only through our five senses. Can you imagine what the reality would look like if we could have the ability to perceive the ocean the way a jellyfish does with its nerve net instead of a brain, or marmoret fish that perceives its environment through electric fields around it, or the pressure gauging lateral lines of sharks, or the sonar of bats and dolphins, or God only knows how an octopus perceives its environment. So we are looking through small, tiny peepholes we call our senses. So one shouldn't be surprised that there are other realms higher than Olam Asiya, than the world of Asiya, spiritual realms. It shouldn't be so shocking, because even in the physical realm, we really don't see what's out there. In fact, if we were to use our senses but magnify what we're looking at to the level of the atomic realm, we would see atoms of sodium and chloride, molecules of water that look nothing like the ocean. And if you were to use two magnifying glasses to look at the quantum realm, you might see just a homogeneity, a quantum field, which is non-dual. So, you know, one has to have some degree of humility as science, Western science should be more humble in what it thinks it knows. It knows a lot. I'm not disparaging scientists. I'm a scientist myself. But there are limitations, and there's a great deal to understand of reality that isn't necessarily perceptible directly by our senses. Another concept which is vital in understanding the way the cosmos is built from a Kabbalistic perspective is the idea of interinclusion, or hitkalalut in Hebrew. I showed you that everything is made of 10 Sefirot. But if you were to look inside any Sefirah, let's say chesed, loving kindness, you look inside it, what you would see are 10 mini Sefirot inside this single Sefirah. And if you were to look inside one of the mini Sefirot, you would see 10 mini Sefirot ad infinitum. This is a fractal design. This is like a hologram. And this is the way the Kabbalah for millennia have been describing the way reality unfolds. And to me, it's remarkably similar to the Vedic idea, the Hindu idea of Indra's net, where the universe has at its many nodes these jewels, where each jewel reflects all the other jewels of the cosmos. I don't see much of a difference between Advaita Vedanta's Indra's net and the Kabbalistic concept of interinclusion. William Blake, actually, the poet, captured this beautifully in one of his poems when he wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." This is hitkalalut. This is Indra's net, perhaps. Now, what I'm going to show you now are several slides that conflate the sciences more with the Kabbalah, which is, I find, dramatic and quite astonishing, and something that was pretty impossible until about 120 years ago. Before 100 years ago or so, there was a revealed Torah, and there was a Kabbalah, and there were the sciences, but the Torah, Judaism, didn't have much conceptually in common with, let's say, Newtonian physics. There were two solitudes. There was religion, there was science. But this changed with the advent of relativity and quantum mechanics, because in many ways, the mystical Jewish tradition seems to almost speak the same language as some aspects of relativity and quantum physics. And I'm going to illustrate that for you based on some of the concepts that I've already expounded. For example, I mentioned the idea of interinclusion, that the part recapitulates the whole. And we now know that there's a physical correlate of this. This isn't mysticism anymore. It isn't science fiction. It's physics. For example, holography. The holography was discovered in the middle of the 20th century by Dennis Gabor. And a hologram has some rather dramatic attributes. For example, if you were to take a regular photographic plate, not a hologram, just a photographic plate, and cut out the right upper segment, and let's say, a picture of the globe. This right upper segment, in this example, would maybe have in it Siberia. But if you were to take a holographic plate and you cut out the right upper segment and you shine a laser through it, you wouldn't just see Siberia. You would see the entire globe, albeit in miniature. And this is the concept of interinclusion. It's a hologram. And much of the physics of David Bohm, who I already alluded to in an earlier slide, has concluded, his physics and mathematics concluded that the structure of the universe may be of a holographic design. And in fact, there is a great deal about David Bohm's physics, which is receiving more attention now than since he was alive. There's more evidence supporting some of his physics, like the topography of the surface of a black hole, the event horizon of a black hole, which seems to have features of a hologram built into the universe. And there are tremendous parallels between Bohmian mechanics and the Kabbalah, and probably Eastern traditions as well. For example, when David Bohm talks about his hollow movement, that sounds very much like the light of the Ein Sof, maybe Brahman in Eastern traditions. When he talks about implicate order, layer and layer on top of layer of implicate orders of reality, finally leading to an explicate order, that's like the enclosement of the worlds I showed you in an early slide. And when he talks about the holographic universe, well, interinclusion and perhaps Indra's net. Everywhere we look in nature, we are seeing these fractals or holographic type manifestations everywhere. We see it in the elegant fractal geometry of the Mandelbrot set. We see it in the branches of trees, in the fronds of a fern. We see it in the chambers of a nautilus, in the rivers and tributaries seen from Earth in satellite images of the Earth. We see it in the airways of the lung and in the vascularization of the heart. Everywhere we look. Perhaps one of the most jaw-dropping examples of this interinclusion or fractal design is shown in this slide. This was something published in 2017, and it's quite remarkable. On the left is a computer simulation of the synaptic interconnections of the human brain. And on the right is a photograph of what's called the cosmic web. And the cosmic web is possibly the largest structure ever photographed. And what it shows, this cosmic web, are these dots of blue or white light. Each dot is a galaxy made up of, on average, 100 billion stars. And these galaxies form these filaments that meander through the cosmos, as shown in the slide. And mathematically, the topography of these filaments is very, very similar to a computer simulation of the synaptic organization of the human brain. This is sort of interinclusion writ large. And it makes you wonder, since there is a correlation between synaptogenesis and consciousness, correlation between the brain and consciousness at the human level. Perhaps, given the structural similarity, the cosmic web may be correlating with some fantastic cosmic mind, perhaps Kastrup's mind at large, if you will. But the implications of this interinclusion idea are enormous if you can really apply them to your understanding of the universe. For example, it implies that in every atom is recapitulated the entire universe. Although everything in the universe in that atom is hidden, it's in an implicate order except that atom, you see. Same thing is true of time. In every second of time is ensconced all of time, from the remote past to the very, very distant future. It's in every second of time, but it's hidden. We cannot generally mine it unless you have certain abilities, like prophecy, or, if I'm not mistaken, in some of the Eastern tradition, like in Patanjali's yoga, the siddhis, certain potentials of human beings can sometimes dig into the implicate order, whereas most people cannot. And similarly, the interinclusion principle suggests that in every human thought is all of human consciousness and cognition, except it's buried. It's imperceptible except for that one thought that we happen to be manifesting at a given moment. So that's the concept of interinclusion. But there is yet another concept that works hand in hand with interinclusion that's also exceedingly important to appreciate if you want to understand the Kabbalah's ontology, and that's called, in Hebrew, hitkashrut, or interpenetration. And it works like this. I showed you that, let me see if I take this away again. Yes. That, let's say, starting in the world of Bria, it's not the highest world, but it's still a very high entity of creation, that godly influence starts in Keter, the crown, moves through the 9 Sefirot until Malchut, and from the Malchut of the higher world, information then feeds into the Keter of the next lower world, Yetzirah, till it gets down to the bottom of Yetzirah, and then it feeds into the Keter of Asiya, till Malchut of Asiya, and then you get a product, or an event, an object. This is the general scheme of how godliness filters through the creation. But there's another mode, a cross-cutting mode, shown here in gray, where at the same time as this is occurring, God can, for example, turn on the light of, let's say, the Sefirah of Chesed, loving kindness, throughout every nook and cranny of the cosmos simultaneously. So all of Chesed lights up, and then a few minutes later, let's say, all of Bina lights up, etc. This is a much more integrated understanding of how the pieces of the cosmos come together. And it's not that God sometimes uses the more linear domino-like fashion to run the universe and sometimes the cross-cutting mode. No, he uses both of them concomitantly. They're both occurring at the same time. And for us to appreciate that, it's more a shift in our consciousness than in the underlying metaphysic, if you understand what I mean. Now, this concept, as strange as it may sound, there's a scientific correlate of it. It's called quantum entanglement. And this is what the Nobel Prize was awarded in physics in 2022 for. And to illustrate it, what happens is you have a progenitor particle. And let's say this particle decays into two particles, let's say two photons, photon A and B. And photons have a characteristic called spin. And spin can be either up or down. And what is known by the laws of quantum mechanics is that if particle A is spin up, particle B that came from the same progenitor must be spin down. It's anti-parallel or anti-correlated. Now, this anti-correlation of these sister particles exists regardless of how far separated these particles are in space. So particle B can move across the universe from particle A. And if you were to manipulate particle A by changing it from spin up to spin down, particle B would immediately switch from spin down to spin up, no matter how far apart it is from particle A. This was extremely bothersome to Albert Einstein. He couldn't stomach this because it suggested to him that information was being transmitted from particle A to B at supraluminal speeds, which defies the theory of special relativity. So he couldn't accept it. But we now know that if you look at it through Bohmian eyes, this makes a lot of sense, because in the implicate order, which transcends space and time, these two particles in the implicate order are really part and parcel of the same thing. Just like the various little parts of the tiger's face in the low world of Asiya, when you move up the worlds, you see the integration. So in the implicate order, they're not separate, and therefore no information has to travel from particle A to B. These changes happen concomitantly because in a deeper realm, they are part and parcel of the same thing. This is my understanding of the Kabbalistic notion of interpenetration. I showed you interpenetration in terms of space, but the same thing we now know happens in time. Particles in time can be interpenetrated and interconnected. There's entanglement in time. I'm not going to go through what this experiment is showing, except to make one comment that possibly, and please, Tev, correct me if I'm mistaken, but interpenetration in time could relate to the concept of karma. But maybe in the discussion, you can tell me why that is true or not. In this slide, I sort of summarize that in the Kabbalah, there are concepts that are very counterintuitive, such as the unicity of the Ein Sof, the infinite light of God, the light of the Ein Sof. There's dimensionality, hitlapshut. These are the concentric worlds, one on top of the other, like the implicate orders of David Bohm. Interinclusion, like a fractal design of the universe, or a hologram hit kalalud, and interpenetration hit kashrut. But if you look, you will find examples of these concepts in many, many other traditions, mostly in Eastern traditions, but I think there's truth also of these ideas in mystical Christianity and in certainly in Sufism in Islam. For example, in Hinduism, just to take one example, this unicity can be viewed as Brahman. Dimensionality as a loka system, interinclusion like Indra's net, and interpenetration may have some relationship to the notion of karma. Now that I've sort of spelled out for you the metaphysics, the main structure of the creation as seen through Kabbalistic lens, I'd like to give you an example of how God governs the world and how he uses the Sefirot to do so. And I'm going to use an analogy. Instead of talking about how God runs the world, I'm going to talk about a woman who has a desire to live in a house. That's like God desiring to have a cosmos. In stage one, suddenly a desire comes out of nowhere. It's a transcendent quality. And that happens in the Sephirah of Keter, that highest of the Sephirot crown. Next, an undifferentiated image pops into her mind of the kind of house she wants. Cottage, let's say. And this is in the next Sefirah of Chokhmah, which means wisdom. It's a fully integrated idea in her mind of what the house should look like. But now, in order to move towards that realization, she has to develop architectural plans for the type of house that she wants, for the infrastructure, like the dimensions, the materials, the actual design of the house. This happens in the next Sefirah called Bina, which is understanding. Now, these three Sefirot, Keter, Chokhmah, Bina, or Chokhmah, Bina, Dat, in another frame of reference, doesn't matter. These three are the conscious Sefirot of every Decasephirotic system. And since everything is made of 10 Sefirot, everything has to have some sort of consciousness. And that's why I refer to the Kabbalah as panpsychist in its ontology. And the lower 7 Sefirot are bodily, unconscious Sefirot. Here's a picture of the relationship of Keter to the other Sefirot. I show Keter influencing the other Sefirot as if it's passing through a wormhole to sort of indicate that Keter is always that Sefirah that's transcendent, that's outside of your frame of reference, as it were. Now, Keter does talk to Chokhmah and Chokhmah to Bina, etc., all the way down to Malchut. But shown here is a very special quality that is unique to Malchut, and that is a direct linkage to Keter. While Keter talks to Chokhmah and Chokhmah to Bina, Keter also has a direct communication with the lowest of the Sefirot, Malchut. Because as I mentioned, Malchut is a transducer. And Malchut, therefore, will create a product that is perfectly in line with the will up in Keter, so that her house is exactly what she initially willed. So from Keter, though, the natural flow of information is from Keter to Chokhmah. Chokhmah is your first of your immanent Sefirot. Remember, Keter is somewhat transcendent. The first of the immanent ones is Chokhmah. Chokhmah can be viewed, if you look at it from the astronomy or cosmology, it's like the cosmologic singularity of the creation. Everything's in there, but it's point-like. In a human being, it's represented by the right hemisphere. It's what Ian McGilchrist refers to as the master. It provides a gestalt of a concept, the big picture. It's a eureka moment. The scientist suddenly gets a flash of original thought. Excuse me. It is more represented by vision than by hearing, because you can see a picture in one eye gulp, as it were. It's more friendly to paradox, and it's relied on more by Eastern philosophical thinking than Western thinking. The information as a singularity passes from Chokhmah to the next Sefirah here, Bina, which is understanding. This is like the Big Bang aftermath. In human beings, it's what the left hemisphere does, or McGilchrist's emissary. Now, there's no longer a gestalt, there's differentiation. And for example, a single thought is now expressed as language, chopped up into bits of language so that it could be understood by somebody else. It's hearing more than vision. It's intolerant of paradox, very rigid in its thinking, and it's represented more by Western philosophy than Eastern philosophy. Okay, so the architectural plans have now been created, but she doesn't want architectural plans. She wants a house. So she now has to go through the process of actually having the house built. So she hires a construction company. And the construction company is made up of the next 6 Sefirot, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netz, Chod, Yesod, which work in unison to physically build the house. And when the final nail is banged into the house, This is the job of Malchut, the 10th Sephirah, the transducer, which then creates a house satisfying or satiating her initial desire in the highest Sephirah of Keter. And she has a house. Okay, but now she focuses on furnishing or decorating her living room. So this whole process starts again in a fractal fashion, as you can see. There's now a mini Keter, which activates sequentially 9 lower Sephirot, which are necessary to furnish a living room according to her desire. And this and other sub-Keters are nested hierarchically or in parallel within this overarching Keter prime for her to eventually get a house of her liking. There is an interesting notion that comes out of Lurianic Kabbalah. Isaac Luria, one of the, perhaps maybe the most important Kabbalists that ever lived, according to some, in the 1500s, 1600s. And his concept is called Shvirat HaKelim in Hebrew, or shattering of the vessels. When the initial world of Atzilut, that's the second world, was created, there was an initial mismatch between the light and the vessel, which caused the lower 7 Sephirot to shatter, to break. Whereas the top 3 conscious Sephirot, there was a distortion, but they never broke, they never shattered. I believe this has some important implications because the unconscious aspect of every decasephirotic system can be made of innumerable parts, like the organs of the human body, the spleen, the liver, the kidneys, etc. Whereas consciousness, because the top conscious Sephirot never shattered, there's always just one consciousness to a customer or to an individual, whether that individual be a human being or a lizard or a pebble. An interesting correlation between the Kabbalah and our understanding of consciousness. So to summarize, we saw that the Kabbalah is panpsychist in its nature because the top 3 Sephirot of every system is conscious. The lower 7 are unconscious. The 10 Sefirot and consciousness is built hierarchically, holographically, and I'll show you also relativistically as well. As follows. The Torah, not just mystical Judaism, but the Torah in general, divides the creation into 4 domains. The first one in Hebrew is called domem, which refers to inanimate objects. There is consciousness because they have top Sefirot, but consciousness in a rock simply informs form and substance. The next level up is tzomeach, which means plant life. Consciousness is a little bit more established, and now consciousness will inform growth and reproduction, which is denied to the inanimate class. Third level up is animal life. Now consciousness allows for emotions, sentience, cognition. And finally, medaber, which means speaker, referring to human beings, where there's, in addition to sentience, there's self-awareness, rationality, morality, ethics. This slide is central to my presentation, and it's the slide which all the other slides sort of pivot around to explain Kabbalistic panpsychism. In this slide, white represents consciousness space. On the left is transcendent consciousness. On the right is immanent consciousness, the consciousness that enters into the creation. So you can see again from here that we're dealing with panentheism, a transcendent light and an immanent light. When you look at domain, inanimate class, let's say a rock, mineral, it's made up of 10 Sefirot, like everything else. The top 3, GR in Hebrew just means top 3, they're in red, are the conscious aspect of the system. And what the top 3 Sefirot of a rock do, it filters a minute bubble of consciousness from the transcendent domain into the immanent domain, just enough to give the rock some form and some substance. The next level up, you have the plant. The plant is also made of 10 Sefirot. The plants also contain minerals. But here's where relativity kicks in. The mineral I mentioned is made of 10 Sefirot, of which the top 3 are conscious. But when a mineral is within a plant, the 10 Sefirot of the mineral are compactified within the 7 lower unconscious bodily Sefirot of the plant. As the plant now expresses or reveals a new level consciousness, which allows the plant to filter a larger bubble of consciousness from the transcendent to the immanent phase, which now allows for growth and reproduction. Moving to the next level of animals, also made up of 10 Sefirot, animals have plant-like attributes of growth and reproduction. But the plant-like attributes are now compactified into the unconscious bodily Sefirot of the animal, as the animal now uses its top 3 Sefirot to filter a much larger amount of transcendent consciousness into the immanent phase, giving the animal sentience, cognition, emotions. And this happens to a much greater extent in human beings. We obviously have animal instincts necessary for our survival, but there's compactified in a relativistic manner into the unconscious Sefirot of the human, as the human now expresses a single consciousness, which is much greater than that of the animal, which is represented by the flux of a much greater amount of transcendent light into the immanent phase. And as I alluded to in earlier slides, as we approach the 7th millennium, there's going to be a tremendous increased porosity of these higher 3 Sefirot, allowing much greater consciousness to enter into the immanent phase, which will profoundly expand our consciousness. But this will probably resonate throughout all the realms of creation. So rocks will be more plant-like, perhaps plants a little more animal-like, but this is conjecture. Now, I mentioned that the Kabbalah is panpsychist, that there's consciousness everywhere. But even the hardcore mainstream sciences are beginning to see this more and more every day. At the time of Descartes, Cartesian philosophy accepted that there's consciousness only in human beings. All other animals and certainly plants and stuff, unconscious. Then in the 20th century, we acknowledged that higher animal species besides man, gibbons, chimpanzees, orangutans, dolphins, whales, certain corvid birds, they must have consciousness, at least as far as we're able to ascertain consciousness in those animals. But now, and this is less than 3 months ago, the New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness is acknowledging consciousness in invertebrates, such as octopuses, cuttlefish, crayfish, crabs, and even some insects, such as bees and fruit flies. And I believe the Kabbalah will teach, or is teaching, and other traditions teach, that consciousness is really throughout the entire cosmos. And there are already books being written on plants showing tremendous ability to sense their environments and compute in certain ways, and even have some sorts of memory and learn from each other, although this is not yet mainstream. And there are individuals that have appeared on your show, Tevin, such as the biologist Michael Levin, who is trying to accrue evidence of some sorts of mentation, consciousness, even at the cellular level. And you may be familiar with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's work, suggesting that even within cells, in the microtubular cytoarchitecture of cells, this, at least in neurons, may be the source of consciousness based on some quantum mechanical considerations. This is basically the last conceptual slide I want to share with you. And it's a very interesting structure in Aramaic called Resha de Los Yada, or in English, the Unknowable Head. And this Unknowable Head is a nexus between what's intrinsically based consciousness, or neural based, and transpersonal consciousness outside of our system. And the way this Rudla, as the acronym goes, Unknowable Head, works is as follows. Let's say God wills something to come into existence. Let's call that something ABCD. Could be an event, could be an object. And this happens, as I mentioned before, in the Sefirot Keter, the crown, where the will happens. What this Rudla does, this structure, this Unknowable Head, it scrambles the message, according to the Kabbalah, into every possible combination of ABCD, BACD, etc., 24 such combinations, transmits the smear of possibilities throughout the lower 9 Sefirot till it reaches Malchut. Then, when we observe something, this causes the smear of potentials to collapse into one product that we witness, and what we see is, let's say, ABCD. This is extremely similar to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the collapse of Schrodinger's wave function. But here's where science and the Kabbalah separate completely, as follows. According to current quantum mechanics, this event, this collapse of the wave function, is a purely random event, a stochastic process. And yes, we saw ABCD, but it could just as easily have been any of the other 23 possibilities. The Torah, or the Kabbalah, says no. Because of this critical Keter Malchut axis I showed you in a previous slide, recapped here, Keter imposes on Malchut to collapse the wave function so that the product can be ABCD and only ABCD. So because we operate below this membrane, this Rudla membrane, things appear to us as non-deterministic, according to Schrodinger's equation. But if we were able to see from beyond the Rudla, a God's eye view of the creation, we would see that there can only be ABCD. So in one sense, things are non-deterministic by the way we live, in the environment we live in, the world of Asiya. But from a godly perspective, things are determined because of this Keter Malchut axis. A very important point, and I've been asked this question by specifically individuals from the Buddhist tradition, is this part, the stochastic aspect of the world we see, the physical world, an illusion? And the reality is what happens above this Rudla. And the answer the Kabbalah gives is no. It isn't illusory in the same way Vedic tradition may conceive of illusion. Because God wanted us to live in what he, in Hebrew, says it's a dira betachtonim, which means an abode below. He made this world, and he's infinite in his powers to create. He made this world as real as the higher worlds. It's very hard to accept that both realities are coextant. But this is the way the Kabbalah looks at it, that what we see down here is as real as what's happening in higher realms. So when we think we have free will, God made it such that we have every semblance of the reality of what free will means. And we agonize over our ethical decisions sometimes, even if God knows what will happen in the future, which is a misnomer to begin with because there's no time where he resides. Now, I mentioned randomness, but even here, what we consider random is not necessarily so. And randomness can be contingent on knowledge. And an example of this is shown here. Let's say you have a radio telescope in your backyard, and it picks up a signal, a message from some distant galaxy. And the message comes as 10 digits from 0 to 9, shown here. All these digits are now pouring out from that galaxy, and you're recording it. When you look at these roughly 1,100 symbols, these digits, the appearance is that of randomness. So there may be some structure physically, not a conscious structure, but something randomly giving out pulses in 10 different forms from 0 to 9 in a random way. Well, you want to test that hypothesis, and you're not happy with just 1,000 or 1,100 digits. You go for 100,000 digits. You expand it. And not just that, but you color code your digits. Each digit different color, and you look at the pattern, and well, sure enough, it looks extremely random. But then one of the graduate students in your lab says, by the way, did you notice that the digits are basically the decimal points of pi, starting with 14159? When you realize that these 100,000 digits are the first 100 excuse me, digits of pi, would you conclude that this is a random signal? I don't think so. And I think you would conclude that there's an intelligence emitting the signal. And that's how maybe we should look at events that are seemingly random in our environment, such as synchronicities. One last example of this randomness, this artist, this sculptor, Shigeru Fukuda. He used to make sculptures out of junk. And when you look at it, well, it looks like junk. And if you were to examine this from every possible direction, you would still conclude it, well, it looks like a bit of an arch, but it's junk-like. Until you shine a light on it and you allow it to cast a shadow. And now, when you see the shadow, would you conclude that this was a random pile of junk, or was this meticulously designed? Obviously, the latter. So that's how I think one should be looking at what we think are random events. They're not as random as they appear. So to conclude, Kabbalistic Panpsychism, all things created, whether they're in the animate realm or inanimate, are made of 10 Sefirot, of which the top 3 represent the brains or the mochen or the consciousness of the system. Consciousness, according to the Kabbalah, is not the product of or secreted by or emergent within or the exclusive domain of neural tissue. It's certainly not an epiphenomenon that's bereft of causal action within the material world, as is promulgated by most materialists, reductionists. According to the Kabbalah, consciousness is primordial to, it transcends, it vivifies, it's immanent within and impacts every aspect of reality, both spiritual and physical. The Kabbalistic view of consciousness is based on fundamental principles of Jewish mysticism, but best viewed, in my opinion, in the context of contemporary quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and philosophy. It's clearly panpsychist in nature, informed by the tenets of panentheism. It's arranged hierarchically and holographically, has some relativistic attributes, and in contradistinction to the current scientific mainstream view, it is capable of downward causation. Kabbalistic panpsychism does away with Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, obviously, because consciousness is there even before matter. But more importantly, it neutralizes that combination problem I showed you on one of the early slides by emphasizing that there's the existence of the mind of God, a universal mind, mind at large of Bernardo Castro, if you will, which in a top-down panentheistic fashion differentially reveals itself within the entire creation hierarchy. This is cosmopsychism, and you no longer have to ask the question that's asked by constitutive panpsychism, is how many consciousness combine to form large consciousnesses, because you're starting with an infinite consciousness to begin with. It also intimates that there are non-local properties of human consciousness that are entangled with transcendent aspects of the divinity. And if true, this would account for the experiences such as extrasensory perception, prophecy, near-death phenomena, and other paranormal experiences that have been documented in almost every culture. So what is the future of human consciousness? I sort of alluded to it already, and I'll read you in translation a statement from the seminal work of Kabbalah, the Zohar, which says that in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, which corresponds roughly to 1840, the upper gates of wisdom, the Kabbalah, will be opened, and also the well springs of wisdom below, which is scientific or secular knowledge. This will prepare the world for the 7th millennium, like a person prepares himself on Friday for Shabbat as the sun begins to wane. And in my last slide, I revisit the idea of synchronicities and suggest the following will be experienced as we encroach on this Messianic millennium. And this is something I wrote for the Pari Perspectives earlier this year. One may anticipate that synchronicities will grow increasingly robust in the course of this transformation, the 7th millennium, and resemble more a new dawn after a long night than brief illuminations of the evening sky by flashes of lightning. So I think I'll stop here, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussion.
Just for the listeners and the viewers, I've got a lot of questions. You've given a similar lecture before to different audiences. So I've managed to tailor a few questions from those lectures by people online. And of course, this one was tailored for Mind Body Solutions. So thank you, Hyman, for that. I really appreciate it. Firstly, I think let's start off with some of the ones I've got from previous lectures that you've given. Initially, what drew you to this intersection of the Kabbalah and Panpsychism? You wrote a book on it. I'll put a link to it in the description. Tell us about that starting journey first.
Yeah. Well, my interest in aspects of Jewish mysticism goes back to my youth. My family's background, especially on my mother's side, were Hasidic. And Hasidism is sort of like a blend of Kabbalah. It's not pure Kabbalah. It's a blend of Kabbalah with general Jewish thought. It makes it more palatable for the mainstream, let's say. And so I was always somewhat knowledgeable about some aspects of Hasidic philosophy, but it was when I was, I think it's about 15 years ago now, when a certain rabbi, Raphael Afalalo, came to our hospital to be the chaplain of the hospital, and he introduced me to the pure Kabbalistic works of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who was a Kabbalist originally from Italy, who lived in the 1700s. And this rabbi, that Afalalo, is an expert in this type of Kabbalah. And when I started to learn it, I was shocked by several things. First, I had never realized how beautifully organized Kabbalistic lore is. In the Hasidic philosophy, you would get little snippets of Kabbalah, like these flashes of lightning shown on the left, which will illuminate our in the Talmud, which would be very helpful, very beautiful. But I didn't see a holistic ontology that the Kabbalah provides in terms of understanding all of reality and the cosmos. And I learned that there is such a beautiful architecture where you can build level upon level upon level of understanding instead of doing it in a motley collection of ideas. And I learned that from this Ramchal, which is an acronym for this Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And in so learning the Kabbalah, this led me to other Kabbalistic texts where it became pretty rapidly obvious that the 10 Sefirot system is the foundation of everything that exists, and that the top three are conscious. They're called mochen in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew even, going back millennia. Mochen means brains. Well, that's a very reasonable definition of panpsychism. So that got me interested in panpsychism. I didn't approach the Kabbalah because I was a panpsychist initially. I sort of became panpsychist through the Kabbalah, if you understand what I mean.
Yes.
The other thing that really floored me and truly amazed me was this conflation of this Radla concept, this unknowable head, with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I was reading about this Radla in a text written in the 1700s. And this is several hundred years before Heisenberg. And I challenge people when I read to them parts of the initial 1927 paper by the German, and I read them parts of the Ramchal's Kabbalah. I challenge them to tell me which is which. Which concept belongs to the Kabbalah and which concept belongs to the sciences, modern sciences. Because for the life of me, I can't understand what analogies Kabbalists drew on, let's say 300 years ago, 600 years ago, 1400 years ago, to make concepts like interinclusion clear to their students. What did they have Indra's net? Maybe.
And it works in a very similar way to Markovian dynamics and Markov blankets as well.
Yes. And I do write about the Markov blankets in that book you refer to, that on Kabbalistic Panpsychism. The Markov blanket is, to me, a mathematical correlate of what the Radla does. It's Friston's work on minimizing free energy, yes, which prevents a microcosm from being completely commandeered or inundated by the surrounding matrix that it's embedded within. And the Radla sort of does that. How? It prevents you from knowing the mind of God. By scrambling God's will, that ABCD, now to us, could be BACD, BCD, it doesn't allow us to directly intuit the will of God. And that's what a Markov blanket is sort of doing, giving a microcosm its autonomy, in a sense, if I understood Friston well. So that's, except unless you have prophecy. Prophecy, as I mentioned in some of my other presentations and in my book, is the ability for the rare individual to pierce this Radla barrier and directly intuit the will of God. But then he loses his semblance of free will. He can only do what he's told to do, because now ABCD is only ABCD. There's no spectrum of possibilities anymore, and that's what prophecy is in Kabbalah.
I mean, at some point, I remember you did one of those lectures with the Essentia Foundation, and Bernardo. You mentioned Bernardo's universal mind. In terms of the Sefirot, and if you think of Keter, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing these correctly, so excuse me if I do mispronounce some of these terms. At what point would someone differentiate between Keter's universal or main mind and an idealist's universal mind, let's say? Well,
my analogy with the woman who wants a house, I mentioned that there's a Keter prime.
Yeah, oh yes.
That would be like the absolute will of God. Mm-hmm. But even within Keter, there are sub-Keters. Like, for now, she doesn't have to think about the whole house, namely the cosmos. She thinks about the living room. Let's say God now wants only to design planet Earth. He's finished with, Andromeda Galaxy now. So there are many Keters that are arranged hierarchically, one underneath the other. They're nested one within the other. And each represent the transcendent will of any system. I'll give you a very crude example of this. A person has a sudden will to become affluent. He wants money. He wants to get rich. That's his initial Keter desire. Later on down the road, he decides, I want to be the CEO of Big Pharma, right? So it's a new Keter, because initially he didn't think of Big Pharma. He just thought of, making money, let's say, right? But now he realizes that one way maybe to do so is to become the CEO of a Big Pharma. So the Big Pharma is nested as a mini Keter within the overarching Keter to make a living. Do you see what I'm saying? But the mini Keter, here's a very important concept, cannot contradict the overarching Keter. The mini Keters have to fulfill the desires that are ensconced within the larger Keter superstructure. They can't contradict.
I think that's weird, because when I was trying to do my research, I sort of see what you're talking about, but I can also see why some people mistake this view as an idealist view. In that the main Keter is sort of this universal mind in a sense, or is this just a complete misinterpretation of the Kabbalism text?
Well, I don't think the Kabbalah is purely idealistic in like a Castrop sense at all, because although the top Sefirot are truly conscious, the bottom are bodily. It's a little bit more like a dual aspect monism, the Kabbalah, where there's a similar substance, but it can manifest as consciousness or physicality, matter, and matter or consciousness. I don't know if this is a valid comparison, but similar in what I read on Patanjali's yoga's system, that guna. Maybe you could tell me what that is. It's a stuff that comprises both physical and mental reality, and it can condense into a physical reality. But nowhere does the Kabbalah say, and this, I did mention this point a few minutes ago, that this physical world is an illusion. Here's where we don't see eye to eye with Buddhism, in that it's God really wanted us down here. He intentionally put us down here and made this world as real as the upper worlds. So how could they both be real, where things are predetermined and not determined? Well, that's why I mentioned the left hemisphere has a lot of trouble with paradoxes of this type. This is more a right hemisphere intuitive thing that Ian McGilchrist loves to elaborate on brilliantly.
And in that regard, you and Ian are actually quite similar, because when we chatted, he's also a dual aspect monist and in Panentheist as well. So you guys actually do sort of align in those views quite a bit.
And we've actually had some meetings where, I'm not sure if you've seen the on Channel McGilchrist, where we do have a long conversation where we see our similarities, few little differences.
And do you want to touch on those differences for all the Mind Body Solution listeners? And I'll put a link to that chat that you had with McGilchrist as well.
What amazed me is that Ian comes from certainly a non-Jewish background, and he stumbled onto Kabbalistic insights that are very valid. Very often when people suggest to me what the Kabbalah is saying, I don't always agree with what they're saying. But with Ian, he's pretty spot on in his analysis. And I find it quite beautiful how he links it to the right and left hemisphere, as I showed you in one of my slides on Chokhmah, right hemisphere being a left hemisphere. And he really does appreciate in his writings, in his books, he does talk about the Kabbalah at some length and accurately.
It's amazing how different religions have had so much to share with regards to their philosophies and how much it's being more acknowledged today than ever before. And I think this goes towards what you were talking about with that final version, the Messianic version of this, is that we're slowly appreciating this a lot more over time and giving it a lot more credence than it previously was post the scientific era.
And can you think of anything more exciting than that? I can't.
I
think that's incredibly exciting.
Yes, it truly.
Humanity will merge into one beautiful consciousness structure eventually. But of course, we're talking about the seventh millennium. According to the Kabbalah, there's going to be an eighth, ninth, 10th millennium. And as I mentioned on some of my other presentations, we can barely understand what's happening in the what's going to happen in the seventh millennium. There are differences of view, let's say, between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides thinks that there won't be a very tremendous changes in the laws of physics, whereas Nachmanides thinks there might be, and in some cases vice versa. So there's a lot of controversy about what the seventh millennium will look like. So we can even less so imagine the eighth, ninth, and 10th millennium. At the 10th millennium, it sounds to me, and I welcome you to comment on what the implications of that might be from your tradition, that the entire transcendent phase penetrates into the immanent phase of consciousness. Then where are we? Are we, and this is a question I raised at the end of my book, and I don't have a clear answer to it. I have some speculation, but I don't have a clear answer. Are we going to be at square one, the way things looked before there was the separation of a transcendent and immanent phase during and my pre-creation slide, panel A, where there's just the undifferentiated light of God? Is that what we're heading to? In which case, what was then the purpose of all these intermediate stages? Or alternatively, and I think Ian McGilchrist really believes this very deeply, and there's some ways that I can see that as well, is that because of the intermediate phases, the final integrated unity will be on a slightly higher meaning than it was before all the separation happened. And he uses the analogy of kitsugi pottery, where Japanese pottery, when a pot, let's say, breaks into like 20 pieces, kitsugi is the art of putting it back together with thin gilding of gold lines that pull together the pieces, and it's much prettier than it was than before it broke. So maybe our final universe, our final cosmos, will be more beautiful than it was even at its inception.
So there is a purposeful aspect to all of this at the end of it.
One would hope so. Yes.
If we're looking at these further stages, do you think that there would be some sort of implication with AI? Do you think AI falls into some aspect here, or is
okay? Yeah. Yes. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, or is that just something that will not add to this sort of messianic or 8th, 9th, 10th generation?
Well, according to my understanding, AI will eventually reach a phenomenal level of cognitive ability, but will never be conscious. Will never be conscious in the sense that we're conscious, because no matter what the most sophisticated imaginable android or computer, its 3 top Sefirot will still be relegated to the inanimate class and will only be able to bring in that small bubble of consciousness, because consciousness and cognition are not identical according to the Kabbalah. And the way I sort of express this notion in my writings is the idea of a creature, if you want to use that term, called the golem. The golem. The golem was something that looked a little like a humanoid. It was made by Jewish mystics throughout the ages, out of clay or wood, mostly clay, and using the power of a book called the Sefer Yetzirah. It's a book of mysticism. It has certain Kabbalistic terminologies that if you invoke them, you can bring that lump of clay to life. And as the legend goes, the mystics would create these golems in order to, let's say, protect Jewish communities and from adversaries or whatever, right? But then the question came up, if you destroy a golem, and these golems, some of them can actually say a few words, and some of them can follow commands, and they can do labor, and they can, as I mentioned, they can defend against enemies and stuff. But then the question in the Talmud came up, well, if you destroy a golem, are you guilty of murder? And the answer, to make a long story short, based on Talmudic reasoning, is no. The golem, at the very, very best, can achieve some level that approximates maybe animal life. And if that's true, you would have to give it animal rights. And Judaism has had animal rights ingrained in its philosophy since the beginning. For example, there's a law that says if you take an ox and, let's say, a donkey, for example, to plow your field, you can't shackle them together because the ox is so much stronger and the donkey will suffer being pulled by the ox. You can't do that. Or if you're going to take the eggs of a nest to eat the eggs, you have to let the mother bird fly away first. It should not witness you taking the eggs because of psychological pain that it could produce to the bird and whatnot. So in my book, I extrapolate from the golem as a form of artificial intelligence to what we may be stumbling on in current times. And if we were to make something like a golem, if you can extrapolate from the Torah law, I would say that a golem should, or an android should at best be awarded awarded rights of an animal.
Yeah, similar to the April 2021 New York classification, in a way.
Yes, and not human rights.
Yes.
No matter how, no matter what its ability to compute pi or something like that.
Or to imitate the human experience.
Correct, yes.
Tell me, Hyman, for those, I mean, most of the people who listen to this podcast or come to watch this channel, it's a very niche podcast. So they're either familiar with your work or are going to be after this, which is great. You're a clinician and you're a scientist. How do you reconcile these two views? Because a lot of people have trouble trying to figure out how does one discuss these mystical concepts and still practice as a scientist all the time. So do you want to just share that with us?
Yeah, it's a question I've been asked often by both in informal interviews, but also by colleagues at work. And I think I sort of hinted at how it's getting easier for me personally, but also humanity, to be able to reconcile such diverse visions, scientific visions and mystical visions, because of the conflation of things like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the unknowable head, between relativity theory and how something can be conscious when it's in a rock, but once it's incorporated in a plant, loses consciousness, so it's totally relativistic. It's getting easier and easier to be able to reconcile these ideas. So I really don't have any problem with this. Certainly doesn't in any way detract from my research, which is in neuroscience, more specifically studying the role of an enzyme called heme oxygenase 1 and its role in neurodegenerative diseases. I think it just gives me this dual perspective, allows me a more three-dimensional understanding of our reality. That's how I feel about it. And the more I learn the Kabbalah, the more I feel that the sciences, as wonderful as they are, and I'm not disparaging them, is just a thin veneer of reality. It's Bohm's explicate order.
Mhm.
And yet there's so many layers of implicate order. and they're not mutually exclusive. As I showed you,
I'm glad you brought it, because one of my questions, I think I prepped one of these questions. It was, how might the study of Kabbalistic Panpsychism or this dual aspect monism view that you have, and the way you're incorporating this into your actual life, how does it assist you in terms of your research with regards to heme oxygenase 1 or any of your clinical work? Does it impact it, or does it affect it in any ways?
Well, it doesn't directly affect the basic cell and molecular biology that I do in the lab. Mm-hmm. And it affects, because I spend about 70% of my time in the lab, 30% clinical. I'm a clinical neurologist. Mm-hmm. And having this dual perspective, I think definitely has a profound impact in my relationship with all my patients.
Yes. Yes, I can imagine as a clinician, I'm pretty sure that you're able to appreciate phenomenology and phenomenological experiences a lot more.
Well, I don't just look at human beings as a compilation of chemicals, which on the current market may be worth about $1.98, all the sodiums and the potassiums. People are more than just their material existence. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a huge spiritual side to everybody. And knowing that, or feeling a relationship to that, allows me to interact with my patients on a multidimensional level.
Yeah,
and to empathize with my patients' neurological conditions. Even though, and I'll go even further, it even informs to some extent my my understanding of the pathophysiology of certain conditions. Like, for example, I haven't really written much on it yet. I'm planning to, but there are certain diseases that can fit certain Kabbalistic molds. For example, I mentioned to you that there are 10 Sefirot, of which the top is Keter, but there are times when we don't discuss Keter, we discuss another one inside the system called Da'at, which is basically knowledge. And there is an intriguing correlation between what's called the default mode network, which is a network of neurophysiology that not everybody, a lot of people are studying today, and these Sefirot. So in diseases where there is an increase in Keter type behavior, like schizophrenia would be an example that comes to mind, then because of what I mentioned, that there's a reciprocity between Keter and Da'at, when Keter blazes, Da'at is diminished. Similarly, the default mode network, which is sort of like a neural correlate of Da'at in some ways, we know that in the schizophrenic brain, that network is suppressed. Exactly as I would have anticipated based on the relationship of Keter and Da'at. And there are other examples where the opposite happens, like in Parkinson's disease, where it looks like there is a blunting of the permeability of the Radla, so less transcendent light can penetrate in. So the Parkinson mind is very rigid and cannot switch sets very easily. And yet, when you look at the default mode network in a Parkinson patient, it's higher than it is in a normal person. It's sort of like the reciprocal or the opposite of schizophrenia, which sort of makes sense neurochemically, because schizophrenia is a hyper-dopaminergic state and Parkinson's is a hypo-dopaminergic state, which everybody sort of recognize, or many people recognize. But what I find intriguing is that I can relate it to ancient Kabbalistic constructs. So that's an example that might inform my thinking.
That's a pretty cool example, but I'm trying to figure out when you're approaching this, because I'm assuming at some point you're going to take this into your own research and try and fuse this somehow. Do you find it quite difficult, because obviously science is this enterprise of falsification, you're using Popperian methods to do this, and then within your tradition it's very different. This it relies on very different methods of knowledge. what would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a profound point because I don't necessarily try to mesh them into one system of thinking at all. I don't force them together. When they conflate, wow, that's a gift. I love it. It's beautiful to see. But I don't necessarily have to squeeze, round pegs into, square apertures or whatever the expression is, because of what you just mentioned. In order for science is a method. I don't view science as just a body of knowledge. It is that too, but it's a method of accruing knowledge. And one of the tenets of science is that it has to be potentially falsifiable to be considered scientific. But that's not a criterion you need to apply to the Kabbalah or any of the, let's say, Eastern meditative traditions, because we gain the knowledge not through experimentation, but through revelation. If God decides to reveal fact A to person B, that's the revelation happens. Person B does not have to do a scientific experiment that he can then prove to be potentially falsifiable. Revelation doesn't have to be falsifiable or non-falsifiable.
Yeah, it's similar for an
thinking. It's a very different way of thinking. Now, I will add one thing, though, that there's a difference between science and scientism.
Yes.
Scientism, I don't agree with. I agree with science. I love it. It's beautiful. Scientism is almost elevating science to the level of a religion.
Yes.
It's accepting certain materialistic points of view as if they're gospel. And I find that problematic. For example, the scientists will argue, like I just did, that something, for it to be within the realm of science, has to be potentially falsifiable. But now, every physicist and his brother is talking about the multiverse.
Yeah, string theory.
That there's an infinite number. That's the other example I was going to raise. Multiverse is even better.
Yes.
That many, maybe not all, but a sizable fraction of physicists believe there's a multiverse. Well, the multiverse is not falsifiable, even in principle. So is it science? It isn't science, but they view it as such, or they want to. Why? Because the anthropic principle is becoming so compelling, so overwhelming, that it looks like every aspect of the universe is designed by a vastly superior intellect, by some great intelligence. If things were off, if the laws of nature were off by a fraction of a percent, the universe as we understand it, and certainly human beings, would not exist. And there's a million ways to make it go wrong, and yet it doesn't go wrong. Here we are. So the scientist is unhappy with that. I'm talking about the materialist scientist, the physicalist, is unhappy with that because it suggests a superintelligence. And they're not necessarily comfortable with that. They were raised in what's called positive, logical positivism, that if it isn't available to experimentation to the third person, it's not real. So that's why when we talked about consciousness is a first person phenomenon.
Exactly.
And therefore they rejected it, but they couldn't deal with the anthropic principle. Said, well, let's throw in a multiverse. But that's a bit disingenuous because it's not science, and neither is, as you mentioned, string theory, which, there's just no way so far to gather or garner evidence of it.
I think a big part of that logical positivism, it comes with that anti-theism. There was a generation that sort of grew up with this, and I think it might be partly because of the supernatural aspects of it all, and trying to not be associated with it. So you can sort of understand why scientism became such a huge thing. I find it strange how a lot of people who really loved science as kids and into their adolescent, teenage, slowly from that hard scientism, slowly become less ingrained into that, and become a bit more open-minded, which is strange. It's almost like they're becoming wiser and getting towards that Messianic self, even with age.
It is a type of maturation that happens, but not to everybody.
Yeah.
In fact, I have colleagues and friends, very intelligent people. Some are deeply religious and some are atheistic. And to each of those two, the more they learn about science, the more they become, their view becomes more ingrained.
Mm.
The religious person becomes more spiritual, and the atheistic individual becomes more atheistic in his life, in his practice, in his philosophies.
I am very much I'm non-religious, but I am Hindu in terms of my upbringing, and I consider myself very, very much am more inclined to a non-religious belief. But however, I'm very agnostic regarding the ontological reality. I don't really know what's out there. And I think that that agnosticism regarding the ontology of it all allows me to have these communications, because had I had a fixed view on it and said I am 100% certain this is not true, I think having these conversations would be very difficult. And that
I would imagine.
Yeah, and I think that having that little bit of an open mind is exactly what every atheist needs to have. That you can't be 100% certain, because that's just as real. If they want to say that that's not religious, that is very religious.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
it's pretty much what is the saying? Calling the kettle black. Yeah.
Yeah. But don't you see yourself how and this should at least keep one agnostic and not atheistic, is don't you find it remarkable how current concepts of physics, such as holography, relates to ideas as like Indra's net?
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. There's a lot more than that. Like whenever I look back at some of the teachings, I often think about how much it's so similar to what we learn about the universe and cosmos, and what they knew back then in terms of my religion, Hinduism. It's amazing to see what the Vedas actually said and how they really expanded this to the cosmos so many years ago. This is thousands of years ago, and it took such a long time to get to it.
Through experimentation. There was no experimentation. This was revelation.
And look at Sanskrit as that form of knowledge was not science. It was more of a linguistic approach, and you cannot take away the religious aspect from it, because it's so ingrained into that form of knowledge, and that's why it's just not science. It's a completely different version of gathering information.
Yeah, well, Hebrew is very much like that also. Each Hebrew word has layers and layers of meaning, and some of the meaning actually spills into the sciences. I can give you examples of that. But Hebrew and each Hebrew letter has a numerical value. So a lot of ideas in Judaism, and especially in Kabbalah, are by setting up equations based on Hebrew passages. If they equal the same thing, then they have to have something in common numerically, not just syntactically or linguistically. I'll give you one example of what I mean by this Hebrew having this property. It is only since Einstein that we can appreciate that space and time are really one and the same thing, which we now refer to as space-time. Yeah, 4 dimensions of one thing called space-time. Before Einstein, space and time were radically different concepts. But the Torah uses the word olam, which means physical world, space. And it uses the term olam va'ed to mean forever. So it equates the olam, made up of the 3 root letters, ayin, lam, and mem, is the root of the word space and the root of the word time. Yeah. And this precedes Einstein by quite a number of years.
Yeah.
And many, many examples of that in the Torah. And I wouldn't be surprised if Sanskrit,
Yeah.
also
There's
has this kind of great wisdoms.
many examples. So Hyman, let's sort of summarize just for all of those listening, all of those watching. So this view is very much panpsychist, panentheist. It's hierarchical. There's a holographic aspect to this, and it's all relativistic. Is there anything about it that you want to mention that you feel just want to nail down that point so people don't misunderstand this, or at least take away the message and with greater detail?
Well, I think, honestly speaking, if somebody really wants to understand this topic, I tried very hard to make my slides. That's why I give slides presentations, I think. But if you follow the slides through, and maybe more than once if necessary, because some of the concepts are arcane, they're esoteric, I think you can get a true feeling for some of the ways that the Kabbalah looks at reality in general and consciousness in particular by seeing the flow of concepts that I presented in these slides. I think they provide not the only perspective. Oh no, there are, even amongst the Kabbalists, there are major disagreements on virtually every point. It's not as dogmatic as one set of slides might intimate. There are other ways of looking at consciousness, or other ways at looking at these principles of interinclusion and interpenetration. I gave you my perspective, which is heavily colored by contemporary science. Makes it easy for me to see what the mystics were saying by translating it into scientific metaphor. And that's my approach. So I think it's fascinating, and I would recommend that individuals, and I'm saying this out of some experience because people who have written to me and have communicated with me have said that they're not Jewish, or they're not certainly following Kabbalistic tradition, but they're seeing aspects of this in their own culture, whether it's religious culture, secular culture, scientific, and that brings me a great deal of joy that I'm a lumper, not a splitter, as they say in medicine, right? I like to see commonality and not just diversity. And I like to see what Goethe referred to as multiplicity in unity, and not unity in multiplicity. There's a big difference. To start from unity and see how it all evolves into multiplicity, which is what I've read recently in the works of the Panpsychism and Abhinavagupta and the Tantras. And I'm seeing the same sort of concept, not exactly the same. And it's not even the same within the Indian traditions.
Yeah.
Within meditative traditions, there's huge difference. Some are dualistic. Some are, Patanjali's yoga says, the sutras, I see it as dualistic. There's, correct me on the pronunciation, Purusha and Prakriti are very different. One is self-consciousness, one is matter. But in other, what I've seen recently in some of the Indian traditions, mind is considered in the realm of matter.
Yes.
It's where you draw the line in consciousness differs tremendously. I'm seeing in different Indian traditions.
Yeah, and it's the same thing about what you spoke about earlier, that revelations, whereas in some Indian traditions that takes the form of experience or pure consciousness. It's more of a transcendence. It's very similar. They're talking about something similar, but in different ways.
Yes, in different ways.
It's a great time to be alive, because this whole community, I think you mentioned Michael Levin in your slide, and you had the slide with him. I saw him retweet a tweet by Mark Solms of you and Ian McGilchrist and Mark chatting. And it's such a cool time to be alive, to see all these different thinkers getting together. And we spoke about this, Michael and I, just recently, about 2 weeks ago, about this diverse group of people coming together and lumping together the way you're speaking about, rather than breaking away and doing things separately.
Yeah, and I think the key that undergirds this endeavor really has to be a search for truth, mutual respect. I think with that approach, I think a lot of people would find tremendous parallelisms in other cultures and other traditions that are so similar to what's within their own tradition.
Yeah.
And that's a way of unifying humanity if you can see that clearly. I think.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of this channel, this respectful, open discourse. Thank you so much, Hyman. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm grateful for your time. There's so much I'd love to chat about in the future as well. So all the people watching and listening, I'll allow them to comment, let me know what questions they have, and I'll try and filter through all of them and get to you and see how we can even fine-tune this further in the future.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This was a tremendous pleasure for me to interact with you on these topics. I really, really enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll have more opportunities in the future to do so.
No, I definitely think so. We need to get to that Messianic state as soon as possible.
Thank you.